They laughed at his map long before they ever understood it. In the early years of the Second World War, when strategy was still dominated by battleships, massed infantry, and blunt force planning, the idea that a single map could influence the fate of an entire invasion sounded absurd. To many senior officers, maps were considered static tools, reference sheets pinned to walls or folded into pockets, useful but hardly decisive. Victory, they believed, came from firepower, numbers, and bold commanders. Yet behind the scenes, far from the front lines, one quiet specialist was rethinking what a map could be, not as a simple depiction of terrain, but as a weapon. And when the largest amphibious invasion in human history finally came, it was his work, once dismissed, even mocked, that helped make D-Day possible. In the interwar years, military cartography was often treated as a routine technical service. Surveyors measured distances, drew coastlines, and marked elevations, but their work rarely influenced high-level strategic decisions. Many officers relied on outdated charts, some based on civilian surveys or even tourist maps. Beaches were labeled vaguely, tides were estimated loosely, and underwater obstacles were largely ignored. This complacency was not born of ignorance alone, but of tradition. Armies had crossed rivers and stormed shores for centuries without needing perfect data. Why should this war be any different? The man at the center of this story did not fit the image of a traditional war hero. He was not a decorated general, nor a charismatic leader of men. He was methodical, analytical, and deeply obsessed with details most others found tedious. Raised far from the centers of power, he developed an early fascination with geography, coastlines, and how natural features shaped human activity. Where others saw a beach as a simple stretch of sand, he saw gradients, sediment composition, tidal behavior, and hidden dangers beneath the waterline. To him, terrain was not passive. It acted on soldiers, vehicles, and plans, often with brutal consequences. When war broke out, his skills brought him into military service, but not into prestige. He was assigned to mapping and survey units, places where ambitious officers rarely volunteered. His early reports were thorough, dense, and unapologetically technical. They warned about landing zones that appeared suitable on paper but would trap vehicles in soft sand, flood infantry at certain tide levels, or expose troops to fire from unseen high ground. He argued that without precise coastal intelligence, any large-scale amphibious operation would risk catastrophe. Many senior planners were unimpressed. Amphibious doctrine at the time was limited, and few had experience with complex landings under fire. His insistence on exhaustive detail was seen as excessive, even obstructive. Some officers joked that he was trying to map every grain of sand. Others accused him of slowing down planning with academic concerns. In meetings, his briefings were often cut short. His maps, filled with annotations and warnings, were set aside in favor of cleaner, simpler charts that looked more reassuring. But he persisted. As Allied leaders began to seriously consider an invasion of Western Europe, the challenge became clear. The coastline of Nazi-occupied France stretched for hundreds of miles, heavily defended and poorly understood. A successful landing would require not just courage, but precision. Where could tanks land without sinking? Which beaches allowed rapid exits? How would tides, currents, and weather interact on a specific day? These were not theoretical questions. They would decide whether men lived or died in the first minutes of the invasion. Traditional intelligence sources were insufficient. Aerial photographs provided some information, but shadows and camouflage hid critical details. Pre-war maps were outdated. Civilian surveys did not account for military needs. The man whose maps had once been ridiculed proposed a radical solution: build an entirely new, layered understanding of the coastline, combining geology, hydrography, meteorology, and enemy defenses into a single operational picture. This approach required unprecedented cooperation across disciplines. Scientists, engineers, naval officers, and intelligence analysts had to work together. Samples of sand were secretly collected from beaches by commandos and resistance fighters. Tidal patterns were studied in obsessive detail. Underwater gradients were calculated to determine where landing craft would ground, and how long troops would be exposed. The resulting maps were unlike anything most commanders had seen before. They were complex, dense, and deeply informative. Once again, Skepticism followed. Some planners complained that the maps were too complicated to use under combat conditions. Others argued that no plan could survive first contact with the enemy, making such precision pointless. A few even questioned whether the data could truly be accurate, given the secrecy and indirect methods used to gather it. Yet as the invasion plans matured, reality began to erode resistance. Exercises revealed flaws in simplified charts. Vehicles bogged down where the new maps had warned they would. Timings were off when tides were misjudged. Gradually, quietly, his work began to gain traction. Sections of his maps were incorporated into operational planning. Commanders started asking specific questions his data could answer. The laughter faded, replaced by cautious interest. By the time Operation Overlord took its final shape, his influence was everywhere, though his name remained largely unknown. The choice of landing beaches was informed by his coastal analysis. The timing of the invasion was tied directly to his tidal calculations. Even the design of specialized vehicles meant to traverse sand and obstacles relied on the data he provided. What had once been dismissed as academic overthinking became foundational to the plan. On the night before D-Day, thousands of men prepared to cross the English Channel. They carried weapons, supplies, and orders, but they also carried assumptions about the ground beneath their feet, the water around them, and the time they had before the enemy responded. Those assumptions were shaped by maps few of them had ever seen in full, created by someone they would never meet. As dawn broke on June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy became scenes of chaos, courage, and loss. The landings were far from flawless, and casualties were severe. Yet in the midst of the carnage, something remarkable became clear. In many sectors, the terrain behaved as predicted. Tanks reached firmer ground where expected. Landing craft grounded at calculated distances. Tides exposed obstacles when planners had anticipated them, not when troops were already committed. The margin between disaster and success was thin, but it existed and it had been measured. At Omaha Beach, where resistance was fiercest and losses highest, the maps had warned of steep bluffs, limited exits, and dangerous conditions. Elsewhere, at beaches like Gold and Sword, the data allowed for faster movement inland. Across the invasion front, the relationship between planning and terrain was undeniable. The map that had once been laughed at was now silently proving its worth. In the days following the landings, as Allied forces fought to expand their foothold, reports flowed back. Some praised the accuracy of the coastal intelligence. Others noted discrepancies inevitable in any operation of such scale. But no one was laughing anymore. The idea that terrain intelligence was secondary to firepower had been shattered. The invasion had not succeeded because of numbers alone. It had succeeded because planners understood the ground on which those numbers would fight. The man behind the maps did not receive public acclaim. There were no parades in his honor, no medals presented before cheering crowds. His satisfaction came quietly, through confirmation that his work had mattered. In internal reports and post-war analyses, his methods were studied and expanded. Amphibious doctrine was rewritten. Mapping was no longer a support function. It became a core element of operational planning. The legacy of his work extended far beyond Normandy. In later operations, Allied forces applied similar principles, integrating environmental intelligence into every stage of planning. After the war, militaries around the world institutionalized the lessons learned. Specialized units were created to study terrain, climate, and geography as dynamic factors in warfare. What began as one man's obsession became a standard practice. Yet history tends to favor visible heroes. The names remembered are those of generals, politicians, and soldiers who led charges or made speeches. The quiet specialists fade into footnotes, their contributions assumed rather than celebrated. The map that saved D-Day became part of a collective achievement, its origins obscured by the scale of the victory it supported. Still, the story matters. It reminds us that wars are not won by courage alone, nor by technology in isolation. They are won by understanding of enemies, of oneself, and of the environment in which conflict unfolds. In 1944, that understanding came, in part, from a man who refused to accept that maps were merely background details. He believed they could shape outcomes. History proved him right. Long after the beaches of Normandy fell silent, his approach continued to influence military thinking. Modern operations rely heavily on geospatial intelligence, satellite imagery, and real-time environmental data. Every landing, every maneuver, every logistical decision is informed by layers of mapping unimaginable in the 1940s. The principles, however, remain the same. Know the ground, respect the environment, plan with precision. Looking back, it is tempting to view his success as inevitable, but it was not. It required persistence in the face of ridicule, confidence and expertise over tradition, and the courage to challenge assumptions held by those in power. His story is not just about a map. It is about how innovation often enters history quietly, resisted at first, accepted only when reality leaves no alternative. On the eve of D-Day, no one spoke his name aloud on the beaches, yet every step taken, every vehicle moved, and every decision made in those crucial hours bore the imprint of his work. They had laughed at his map, and then, when it mattered most, it saved them.